chapter 18. Good to see the number here tonight. Appreciate very much your presence. In John chapter 18, Jesus is before Pilate. Pilate was, I think we might say, curious about Jesus and questions him for just a moment or two to try and get to the basis of what all of the, popularity and uproar was about. In verse 33, Pilate entered the praetorium again, called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered him, "Are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I should not be delivered to the Jews, but now my kingdom is not from here." Pilate therefore said to him, "Are you a king then?" Jesus answered, "You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, "I find no fault in him at all." Several things could be taken from this, but what we want to take from it is that the kingdom of Jesus Christ is a spiritual kingdom, as I'm sure that we're well aware of. And being a spiritual kingdom, there are things that need to be considered of a spiritual nature. The words of Jesus are telling us this, and there are certain things that the disciples in those days needed to understand, and things that disciples today need to understand as well. So I'm talking about spiritual laws of the kingdom tonight. Now, unfortunately, over many centuries, a lot of the things that are plain in the scriptures have been minimized. Now, when something is minimized, they're reduced in their importance. And once they're minimized to a certain level, whatever that level might be, it's arbitrarily reached. When they're minimized to a certain level, then they're marginalized. It's like something in a book. If there's something in a book and there's a part in there that editors later on don't much care for, or they'd like to do something about it, so they minimize it. And once they minimize this and everybody's not paying a whole lot of attention to it, they take it and they put it over in the margin, where it'll even be considered less. And this is what happens to a lot of spiritual laws in the kingdom. They're minimized and then they're marginalized. And when all of this is finally done, the end result is that people act like there are no laws at all, or there are so few laws that there's not a whole lot to be concerned about. So we're going to study some spiritual matters in the kingdom tonight. And the first one that I'd like for us to consider, and we're not going to go over all the laws now, we're talking about this in general ways, but Jesus requires us to obey his commandments. That seems to be something that's simple and something that can be understood. And indeed it is. But let me ask you this, is it being done? Now, I'm sure there are a lot of people that say, "Oh yeah, we really are," and everything. But in truth, they're not. And this isn't just those folks in the denominational world. We're not talking about that. But even sometimes among churches of Christ. Clearly, the commandments of Jesus are not being kept. But every kingdom, and remember now, Jesus has a kingdom, every kingdom on earth expects its citizens to obey its laws. Now, that's just the way it is. And why should this be any different in the kingdom of Jesus Christ. And so it's really a test or a challenge for those who really love Jesus and those who don't. You can pretty well find this out as time goes on. In John chapter 15, and if you take a look at verses 1 through 17, Jesus says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit he takes away, and every branch that bears fruit he prunes that it may bear more fruit. You are already clean because of the word which I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me, I in him, bears much fruit. For without me you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is cast out as a branch and is withered, and they gather them and throw them into the fire, and they are burned. If you abide in me, and my words abide in you, you will ask what you desire, and it shall be done for you. By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, so you will be my disciples. As the Father loved me, I also have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may remain in you, and that your joy may be full. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends. You are my friends if you do whatever I command you. No longer do I call you servants, for a servant does not know what his master is doing. But I have called you friends, for all things that I have heard from my Father I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should remain, that whatever you ask the Father in my name he may give you. These things I command you, that you love one another. So he says in here that he has an expectation of those who would follow him to keep his commandments. And this section right here in John chapter 15 follows up after John chapter 14, verse 15, where he says, if you love me, keep my commandments. Now, despite these clear statements, there are those out here in the world and in the religious world, and they will make a great profession about loving Jesus, or they'll say loving God. Either way, you want to go with that. And so they'll tell you things along that line. I used to, the place where I worked, I had a friend there, and he would always say, you can't find anybody who loves Jesus or loves God. He'd switch that around once in a while. To love Jesus any more than I do. And I come to find out that this was a statement that he had, borrowed from his dad. His dad made it all the time. And that if you ask either one of them, okay, you've made this statement about loving Jesus, how are you doing with keeping his commandments? And then you didn't get much of a ready answer from that. But that's how it is. And not just with these two individuals. I think that's the case with a lot of people. Because a lot of people think if all you do is love God or love Jesus, then that's it. That's good enough. No more is expected. But that's not the end of what he said, was it? He said, if you love me, keep my commandments. Keeping the commandments is something that's important. Consider the joy in John chapter 15 and verse 11, where we read just a few moments ago. Your joy will be full. Your joy will be full, he says, in the midst of encouraging them to keep his commandments. So keeping the commandments are not some kind of a burden. I think it says that in 1 John chapter 5 and verse 3. These are his commandments, and they're not burdensome. And we can keep those commandments. And so they're not some load that God has put on us that's just too much for us to bear. No, we can keep his commandments. They're not burdensome, as some translations have. And another translation has that they're not grievous. And yet there are lots of people who think that the commandments of God are just more than possible. Not just to keep, but to bear. And so what happens then? Well, a lot of them start to be minimized, and then they're marginalized, and then, well, there's not very many that's left after that. But here's the thing. Keeping the commandments of Jesus, keeping the commandments of God, whichever one you want to say, this really wasn't much of a problem in religious matters. Even in the Dark Ages, there were those that knew that this was something that was important. Now, what their solution was to this was that they started to keep the Scriptures away from people. They kept it away from them because they didn't want them to see what was in there, and for them to find out that the clergy, if you will, were not keeping the commandments. But they knew that the commandments were supposed to be kept. And then, about the 16th century, there came along a couple of fellows, Martin Luther, and following on his heels was John Calvin. And what do they have to do about this? They're heralded as heroes of the Reformation. And neither one of them wanted to establish anything that was new. Both of them wanted to take the existing system of Catholicism and just overhaul it and make it better. But to do away with it, they had no intention of doing that. But what happened with them was that their followers came along and took their teachings and did damage that exists down to this day. That's right. 500 years later, we're still having to deal with this. And what was it that they came up with? Well, Luther was the one who came up with it. The whole of Christianity was basically summed up in Romans chapter 5 and verse 1. You're justified by faith. Luther wanted everybody to believe you're justified by faith only. And Calvin came along, went right along with it. Several decades later, a man by the name of John Wesley, same thing. Well, what does that mean? Well, you're justified by faith. What about keeping the commandments? Oh, no, don't worry about that. You're justified by faith. That's the important thing. So you just believe in Jesus. Just believe in Jesus. And you're a Christian. You're under the grace of God, and nothing more needs to be done. So what happened to the commandments? Well, these doctrines of the Reformation minimized and marginalized and then eventually eliminated. If not all the commandments, a great portion of them. It's interesting sometimes to listen to individuals who believe that you're saved by faith only, and they don't believe that. All of them don't believe that. There was a well-known Baptist preacher years ago. Now, the Baptists are Calvinists. They believe in all this kind of thing, and salvation by faith only. And they would talk to somebody, and they try to get them to make a confession that they believed in Jesus Christ as the Son of God. And finally, they'd get this individual to do that. And after this person has done that, you know what they did next? Well, next, they came along and they said, now, you need to pray this prayer. And you prayed what was called the sinner's prayer, that God, for Christ's sake, would forgive you. I thought you were saved by faith only. Then why do you need to pray that prayer? They didn't even believe their own doctrine, did they? Because they added something else to it. And they added something to it that's not found in the Scriptures at all as a matter of salvation. So this is what's happened, that these commandments that have been given in the New Testament have disappeared in favor of something that just doesn't take much and doesn't require much. Now, let me ask you, does that mean that that would make them extremely popular? Yeah, of course it would. I'm way behind here. Let me catch up. The next point is you don't add to God's commandments. That's another one of the spiritual laws. Now, I'm not saying that some folks intend harm or evil. They really don't do that. They just have problems with the instructions as they exist. And for all intents and purposes, they like to tinker with things. Everybody likes to tinker with things. Ever since there have been automobiles, people have been out there tinkering with automobiles, trying to do this and that and the other. And we tinker with lots of things that you just, it's amazing sometimes. People tinker with, companies tinker with things like shampoo. They want to make it a little better, this, that, and the other, and so on. And I can remember back when everybody used to use soap powders. Now it's all about liquid detergent, but laundry detergent, but used to use soap powders. And here'd be a big box on the shelf. And I remember that Martha used to buy Tide. And there was the Tide on the shelf. And this one time we're in there getting the Tide and taking it off the shelf, and it had this label on it. And it said, new and improved. They've been tinkering with it, hadn't they? And I thought to myself, when I saw that, new and improved. So we had been using old and lousy for years. But see, it's tinkering with this. And sometimes the tinkering's all right. Sometimes it doesn't hurt anything. In a lot of ways, it doesn't hurt anything with shampoo or soap powders. But when it comes to the Word of God, you don't tinker with that. You don't do that. You leave it alone. And another thing is where you don't tinker with medication. You don't do that. If the doctor says you take one of these pills 3 times a day, and in a short order, you'll be feeling better. Now, you don't go home and say, well, if 1 3 times a day will do that, imagine what 2 3 times a day will do. You don't tinker with a prescription or with medications, things like that. And I think that we can understand that quite well. But let me ask you this. Just a simple question here. Despite good intentions, tinkering with God's Word has disastrous consequences. What government or system in the world allows its citizens to just add to the existing laws without recourse? Which one of them is it that does that and has ever done that? I've never done that here. Now, we might ignore some of them, but just to decide that, to just alter it and change it. There isn't any place that does that. We follow laws, no matter how mundane those laws might be. And if you don't follow the laws and if you decide to alter them in some way, you know what you have whenever it's over? You've got chaos. We've got laws for a speed limit. Out on the highway, it's fine over here, bypass, you do 55. I think it ought to be a little more, but you do 55 on the bypass. That's legal. There's your speed right there. But when you go over here past the school in town, you don't do 55 mile an hour. It's chaos. Stop signs, stop lights. That's for other people. Chaos. Jaywalking. You name it. You start paying no regard to laws or tinkering with them or just ignoring them or adding to them, saying it's for someone else or something like that. Chaos is the result. We have a system in our country for our currency, money, and things along that line. Now you go into the store and they tell you that the bill is $57.89. They're expecting, cash or a check or a card or something like that. You can't just go in there and say, I'm not paying with money today, I'm going to pay with Buckeyes. You can't do that. We can't change the laws. There's no system like that. And in the kingdom of Christ, you don't alter, you don't change the laws without some kind of recourse. In Mark chapter 7 and verse 3 through 9, Mark chapter 7, verses 3 through 9, The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands in a special way, holding the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other things which they have received and hold, like the washing of cups, pitchers, copper vessels, couches. And the Pharisees and scribes ask him, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders and eat bread with unwashed hands?" He answered and said to them, "Well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandment of God, you hold the tradition of men, the washing of pitchers and cups, and many other such things you do.' And he said to them, 'All too well you reject the commandment of God, that you may keep your tradition.'" It's interesting that this is in response to the Pharisees finding out that some of Jesus' disciples, it says in verse 2, ate bread with defiled, that is, unwashed hands, and they found fault. This wasn't according to the law. It was according to their traditions, to their customs. But you can imagine this group of individuals, and so here they are, and they come along, and they have this meeting, somehow or another, they're all together, and one of them says, "You know what I saw? I went out there where that Jesus was at, and they were eating bread, and they didn't wash their hands." And what they meant was they didn't wash their hands like we do. And it wasn't just washing their hands. In order to make sure that they washed their hands, they overdid it, like they did a lot of things. They washed them clear down to the elbow. All that. That's how it had to be. If you didn't do it that way, according to them, then you didn't wash your hands. And there's the problem right there. And then they had other things that they did. And when they come back from the marketplace, they had to wash their hands because they might have been in the marketplace. Now say this pulpit here was in the marketplace. And someone who was a Gentile or whatever, had someone who wasn't a Pharisee, had touched it. Well, the whole thing's unclean then. And then what comes along? They touch it or brush up against it. Oh my. When I get home, first thing I've got to do is wash my hands and cleanse my hands. Now that's the kind of society that they were living in amongst these Pharisees. And it was something that was a serious matter. So when Jesus addressed this in Mark chapter 7, verses 3 through 9, he says there are two things. Number one, they had added to God's commandments. And number two, they had set aside some of those commandments. And they did this with their traditions. And a lot of times with their traditions, they buried the commandments of the Lord under their traditions. Now, sometimes we think to ourselves, well, that never happened with us. Really? Really? You think not? Sometimes we do that a certain tradition becomes more than what the commandment is. That we've added it or beefed it up or come along and say, well, you know that this would be right, that there's nothing really wrong with it, and other ways that you dress it up. But it still ends up the same thing. In Matthew chapter 23 and verse 4, when Jesus has another encounter after that other one with the scribes and the Pharisees, he says in verse 4 about how they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. So what's happening here? Well, it very well may be that they thought that they were helping God by doing this. But actually, God wants our obedience and submission and not our adjustments. And sometimes that's a hard lesson to learn. Even though we may be well-meaning with what we do, we don't need that That's not what God wants. So don't add to God's commandments. Now here's another one to consider. And bear with me now, because this one sometimes sounds a little bit alarming. Not all commandments are equal. Now, how do I know such a thing as that? I know this because such things as love, justice, mercy, and faith are the most important commandments. And I know this because I can look over here at Matthew chapter 23, and in verses 23 and 24, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint, anise, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. Blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. So, they were supposed to tithe these things. Yeah, but these other things had more to them. They meant more because they were things that dealt with other people that you associated with, that you were around, your treatment of them, and also out of this your respect for God Almighty. Loving God is the greatest commandment. And next to it is loving your neighbor as yourself. Now, don't we know that? We take a look at this over here in Matthew chapter 22, in verses 36 through 40. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And Jesus said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. The 10 commandments were the foundation for everything else that came after it. All the law and the prophets are based on what the 10 commandments were. The first 4 commandments dealt with God, man's dealings with God. The last 6 are man's dealing with his fellow man. So you love God and keep his commandments. That's the first thing. And then the other is that you love your neighbor as yourself. And I think it's easy to understand about loving your neighbor. You don't kill, you don't steal, you don't covet, you don't bear false witness, all those things. You would do that to other individuals. Don't do that. There's the commandments right there. And then what about the first ones? Well, let's see. You don't make any graven image. You will worship the Lord your God. Him only you will serve. Think about that. That's man's dealings with God. And that pretty well, in the broadest sense imaginable, sums up everything that's in the law and the prophets, all based on the 10 commandments. So there was a difference, and there always has been a difference. But now, one of the things that we need to remember is that that doesn't mean that all other commandments don't need to be obeyed. That somehow or another we minimize all others and marginalize them and something along that line. They're all important. Whatever the commandment is, it needs to be observed. But they're not always all the same. And that's something that has to factor in as we go along. Another thing is that we should not develop spiritual pride. Every time I think about spiritual pride, I think about the case in Luke chapter 18. You know that. It's the Pharisee and the publican. Now, both of these individuals go up to the temple together, and they're in there in proximity to each other. The one knows where the other's at. That kind of thing, that kind of proximity. And so what you have here is you have these, and you look at it, and if you can't see that this is spiritual pride, and you start reading, let's see, about verse 9, and go down to about verse 14. If you can't see this, well, look at it again, and look at it carefully, and notice the things that are in here. Now, here these two individuals are, and they're in there in the proximity to each other. And what I want to concern ourselves, first of all, is the Pharisee. There needs to be care that we don't become like that. like what's said in verse 9 and in verse 11. Jesus spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. You mean there were people that were like that? Yes, there were. And he's addressing people who were like that? Yes, he is. Are there people that are like that today? Yes, there are. And do they need to be addressed today? Yes, they do. Look at verse 11. How the Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself. God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this tax collector. Do you get the picture? Here they are in the temple. And again, they're close enough to be able to see each other. And here this man gets up here and says all of this. I'm glad I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even that guy over there. Where's the spiritual pride here? Does it sound like a good thing? I have to be honest with you. If I had been there and had witnessed something like this, I'd be embarrassed almost out of my mind. Wouldn't you? To think that somebody could do that? Now, it's one thing when somebody elevates themselves a little bit and acts a little bit more, I don't know, or thinks, or has an air that they're better than someone else. They may or they may not. May just be their normal bearing. But that's not what's going on here. He's deliberately doing this. And not only does he say this in the temple where others could hear him say it and where the publican could hear him say this, but he wants God to know that I'm better than that guy over there. And God, I'm thankful for that. What a display, isn't it? And is that the way that we ought to be? Boy, I'm thankful that I'm not like those Pentecostals over there. Boy, I'm thankful I'm not like those people hanging out in the bars over there. I'm glad I'm not like those folks, that make all those movies out in Hollywood. Whatever it is, that somehow or another we've managed to elevate ourselves, and our pride is what matters. And it's what makes a determination in all things. It did with the Pharisees. Is that the way it's supposed to be with us? Even as religious people? I don't think it is. Rather than that, we're supposed to be like the man who was the tax collector. He stood afar off, would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, and beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. You might say he's only concerned about himself right there, but he certainly is concerned about himself in the right way, in a profitable way, isn't he? And furthermore, Jesus said this man went down to his house justified rather than the other, for everyone who exalts himself will be abased, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. So we need to remember to remain humble, and don't let that old spiritual pride enter in there. And this is something that's important. And especially is it important when we consider keeping the commandments of God. We don't want to get involved in the business, well, I just keep them better than the other person. And especially that one right over there. Let's watch that. Because sometimes, maybe, that might happen. And it's not just a pretty thing when it does. The last point is that kingdom conflicts may not be present. Disillusionment. You think about that. Whatever you want to call it. It could be called other words. I think sometimes, what we do is we get words confused. We get words like discouragement and disappointment confused. Well, people might be disappointed about something, but they won't say that, I'm disappointed with this, or maybe someone has disappointed them. And rather than say, I'm disappointed, They say, well, I'm just discouraged. There is a huge difference. When you're disappointed, things just didn't turn out the way that you hoped that they would, or the way that you worked in such a way that they would turn out. That's disappointment when that happens. I've been disappointed a great number of times, haven't you? Sure you have. But discouragement? Discouragement is when something has you beat down. It's got you down there where you just don't think you can go on. And maybe you spend a lot of time just looking at the ground. That's discouragement. And I think a lot of times we get those mixed up. But then there's also other words that begin with a D. I'm not going to cover them tonight, depression and so on. But how about disillusionment? Disillusionment often comes not from the outside. Sometimes it comes from within. And sometimes it comes from very close sources. Take a look at Matthew chapter 10. In Matthew chapter 10, there are several places here where there are things that talk about how the certain things could possibly lend themselves to disillusionment. In verses 16 and 17, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Therefore be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. But beware of men, for they will deliver you up to councils and scourge you in their synagogues. Do you think that might cause somebody to be disillusioned when that happens? Yeah, it would, wouldn't it? Sure, sometimes. And then what do we have? We have 21 through 22. Brother shall deliver up brother to death, and a father his child, and children will rise up against parents and cause them to be put to death. You'll be hated by all for my name's sake, but he who endures to the end will be saved. And I don't think there's any question about that. That's disillusionment in a really big way. And if you're not a party to that actually happening to you, it would disillusion you when you learn that this kind of a thing is going on. Then we move down to the next couple of verses there in verses 24 and 25. A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. It is enough for a disciple that he be like his teacher, and a servant like his master. If they call the master of the house Beelzebub, how much more will they call those of his household? Well, what are we talking about here? Now, the disciple doesn't get above his teacher. One of the things a person has to learn as a disciple is where your place is. You know, I've met one person who apparently their whole, I don't know, he's got to be 40 some odd years old, but his whole life was wrapped up in going to college. Now, just about has to be, because after he went to college, he didn't do anything else except live at home. So that was just pretty much the crowning glory of his whole life right there. And he would talk about going into a class at the beginning of the semester. And he said he had this one professor one time. He said this about a lot of them, not in this way, but I remember the one. And he said his professor wrote something on the board that was the goal of the class, and then wrote down some other things underneath of that. And he said immediately I took issue with him. I thought, you're there to learn, not to teach the class. But I'm afraid sometimes there's folks that are like that. And I'm afraid sometimes we find that among ourselves sometimes. We don't know where we're supposed to be and where our standing is supposed to be. We don't do that. There was a deacon out in West Virginia that got his dander up, and he left, and he went off down the road. And it was kind of hard to finally figure out what exactly went on. And I'm going to tell you what's wrong with him. The elders, when they make a decision, they didn't go to him and run it past him. I guess he thought that they'd have to have his approval. Well, they didn't need it. And not every decision that an eldership would make has to be broadcast to everybody. Not even the deacons. Some things are best to be handled discreetly. But sometimes people just can't get a handle on that. And as a result, disillusionment sets in, and then further problems after that. Verse 34 through 39, do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's foes will be those of his own household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. He who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. He who finds his life will lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake will find it. It's great if everybody in the family was all on board and we're all supporting one another. But sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes the case might be that the whole family is nothing religiously, or perhaps they're all members of a denomination. And then here's somebody who hears the truth, and they want to follow the truth, and they want to obey the truth. And the minute they begin to speak words in that direction, they get a lot of static and a lot of opposition. That can lead to disillusionment. But if they are serious about what they're saying, they'll continue to do that. And we need to realize there's a lot of people that are standing for the truth of God's Word. And it hasn't been easy for them to get to where they're at right now. It's been kind of tough. And sometimes, when you're in a small town, if you take a stand for truth, you can go from being the fair-haired boy at the biggest church in town to a complete social pariah overnight. It's amazing. And I'll be honest with you, that can perhaps disillusion a lot of people. So if all your family, a great number of them, majority of them, are all members of the church and faithful, count that a blessing. And when somebody else isn't, don't put them down. Realize they probably had a very tough go of it. I remember doing some work at a fellow's house, one place I was preaching, and he said, you know, I've heard you mention in sermons a time or two about leaving denominationalism. And he said, I've got no idea about anything like that. He said, my family goes back generations, members of the church. I've got no idea. He says, it must have been tough. Now, I didn't want to get on there and beat a drum or something like that. I just said, well, it sure wasn't easy. But then in a lot of respects, it's not easy becoming a child of God. You've got to get past disillusionment and remain faithful. Living in the kingdom as presented by Jesus Christ, it just might not be a picnic. We need to remember that conflicts are likely going to come from where we least expect it. Sometimes it might come from members of the family, from people that we're close to, loved ones, friends, associates, and even sometimes from other Christians, maybe a source of disillusionment. Now, because of where this comes from, it can cause major problems among brethren. But when Jesus was here on the earth, he suffered rejection by his family. His brothers didn't believe him. His brothers thought that something had happened to him to be thinking about this and doing what he was doing. And then there was persecution by his brethren, the Jews. They were the ones, I know that it was the Romans, but they coerced the Romans into doing away with Jesus. But it was the Jews that wanted him dead. His own brethren, his own countrymen. But he stayed the course, didn't he? And that's what we need to do. We need to stay the course as well. So you can see that being a part of the kingdom requires serious involvement and participation. One ought to be ready to count the cost and realize what commitment is necessary to indeed truly serve the Lord. Is there one tonight that would step out and to obey the gospel of Jesus Christ for the first time, believing in him as the Son of God, repenting of your sins? Be happy to assist you in being baptized tonight. If you've done those things, fallen by the wayside, make correction. But whichever one that you do, remember that as a child of God, as a disciple, it's expected of us to follow the spiritual laws of the kingdom. That's where we live. That's what's important. And the home that we hope for is not here on this earth. It's a spiritual home. So our spiritual life is something that really matters. If we can assist you, this is the right place, this is the right time. Why don't you come all together? We stand and sing.